Slow Dance at Dusk, Book 4 in a Sunburned Land series, written by Juliette Duncan, narrated by Sarah Kennedy.
Chapters 1 to 10.
Chapter 1. Life had continued throwing curveballs at Joshua, but with Julian's death he'd finally struck out. The games of his past were over. There was no looking back. In the 4 months since his brother's body had been laid to rest in the family cemetery at Goddard Downs, life had fallen into a new routine. To the outsider, all might appear normal, but Julian's death echoed in the halls of the homestead and the hearts of all who lived there. Yet, despite the sadness, good had come. The moment Joshua's gaze met Stella's at Julian's funeral, he knew everything between them was about to change. And it had. Their friendship had blossomed and transformed into something he'd never dreamed possible. She was no longer an unattainable desire of his heart, but someone willing to stand by his side as he battled his demons, of which there were plenty. Facing the bitter, angry man he'd become hadn't been easy, but was necessary if he no longer wanted to drift. And that's what he wanted. He didn't want to go through life without direction or focus, chasing fleeting excitement that in the end meant nothing. He didn't want to be like his cousin Sean, but he couldn't become Julian either. He had to be himself. But first, he had to find out who that was. He'd once heard that the love of the right woman could change a man. He wasn't sure if that was true, but as he stood on the tarmac of the Kimberley Regional Airport helipad, gazing into Stella Martin's deep brown eyes, he thought it could be. She'd entered his life by chance at a rodeo in Alice Springs several years earlier, and then returned to it recently when she came to Goddard Downs seeking work. Now, as the station's vet, she'd become more a part of his life than he ever imagined possible. It was almost as if she'd always been part of him. "I wish I didn't have to go." She took hold of his hand as a gust of wind sent her blonde hair flying about her face. She brushed the strands back behind her ear with her other hand and smiled wistfully. She was gorgeous, and the mere sight of her made Joshua's heart quicken. He squeezed her hand as a long breath left his lungs. "I wish you didn't either, but you have to. It's Christmas, and your family needs you." "I could go at the beginning of the year. I feel as if I'm abandoning you." Her concern warmed his heart, and although he wanted her to stay at Goddard Downs for Christmas, he couldn't allow her to sacrifice that special time with her family. Since Julian's passing, Joshua had gained a new appreciation of family. His one regret was that it had taken him so long to arrive at this point. "I wouldn't want you to do that. This is the first time your entire family will be together for Christmas since before you were born. You can't miss that." "I know, but I'm torn. Things between us are just beginning, and the rainy season is here, and the station needs every hand." "The station can manage 2 weeks without you." He stepped forward and raised his hand to her cheek while gazing into her eyes. "But I'm not sure I can." He cleared his throat. "And with regards to us, I'd say things are going just fine. Wouldn't you?" She gave a smile that sent his pulse racing. Her smile emboldened him, and he felt stronger, like he could do anything if she were beside him. He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favour from God. He blinked. A wife? Before Stella, he'd never had a steady girlfriend, let alone considered marriage. But this wasn't the first time that thought had come to him since meeting her. "Are you okay, Joshua?" She looked at him with enlarged eyes. His brow furrowed and he swallowed hard. "What makes you think I'm not?" Taking hold of his other hand, she squeezed both gently. "I know you're still carrying guilt over Julian's death and that you're still mourning." Her gaze softened. "I'm here for you if you ever need to talk." It wasn't what he was thinking, but she was correct. He hadn't spoken to anyone about the lingering guilt he carried over his brother's death. Everyone, even Janella, had assured him it wasn't his fault. No one blamed him, but he simply couldn't shake the feeling that if he hadn't been so hot-headed and blind when he'd rushed off to Kununurra, leaving the family in the lurch, then perhaps Julian wouldn't have gotten into that truck in such a state of mind, and he'd still be alive. "Joshua?" Stella squeezed his hands again. "I can see it in your eyes. Don't do that to yourself. What happened to Julian wasn't your fault. You know that. So did he." Joshua nodded slowly. She was right. Julian knew. He remembered the feel of his brother's hand squeezing his as he lay in that hospital bed, connected to machines, barely hanging on to life. Joshua had made it to his bedside in time to ask for forgiveness and to say goodbye, but it was too late for them to ever be the brothers they should have been. So many wasted years. They'd caused such grief to their father and to their family, and to God. He drew a deep breath and shook his head to push the memories away. "You should get going. You don't want to miss your flight." "Are you chasing me away?" Stella's voice held a hint of amusement. "I'd never do that." Stepping closer, he cupped her face with his hands and gazed into her eyes. "It took us long enough to get to this point." She wrapped her arms around his waist and smiled. Although she was tall for a woman, he still towered over her by several inches. "I'm going to miss you," she whispered, longing filling her voice. "I already miss you," he replied. "But the sooner you go, the sooner you'll be back. I want you to enjoy this trip. Make the most of the time you have with your family. Make every second count." She nodded. "Only if you promise to do the same." "I promise." He lowered his mouth and brushed her lips gently before deepening the kiss. He couldn't bear the thought of being apart from her for 2 weeks, and when she finally stepped back, he felt the loss immediately. "I'll call when I get to my parents' place," she said, picking up the small bag from the ground and hoisting it onto her back. "I'll be waiting," he said, soaking in every inch of her. She gave a quick smile and then walked away. If he wasn't mistaken, she had tears in her eyes. As Stella headed to the taxi stand, she stole several glances at Joshua. Although her lips still tingled from his kiss and the distinctive scent of his spicy cologne lingered in her nostrils, her heart felt as heavy as her feet. Why was doing the right thing so hard? Spending Christmas with her family wasn't a chore, but if she were honest, she'd rather spend it at Goddard Downs, with Joshua. Brushing the tear from her eye, she gave one last wave and hitched her bag higher. She'd packed lightly since she wouldn't be in Cootamundra long, just 2 weeks, and she had no special plans other than spending as much time with her family as she could. Some of her cousins on her mother's side she hadn't seen in years, and she was also keen to see firsthand how her parents were settling into their new home. Despite not wanting to go, she needed to. Behind, the noise from the helipad as a helicopter landed was almost deafening as she crossed to where a taxi sat waiting. She greeted the driver, a middle-aged man of Middle Eastern appearance, and opening the back door, she stuffed her bag onto the seat before turning to give Joshua another wave. He was standing right where she'd left him, and he was so downright hot that the mere look of him made her knees go to jelly. Short, dark hair, the smattering of whiskers on his chin, muscles rippling under his crisp white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up and tucked into a pair of snugly fitted jeans. When he raised a hand and smiled, she fought the temptation to grab her bag and run to him. How had this happened? Only 5 months earlier she'd been fighting the attraction, but now, having admitted their feelings for one another, it was as if there was no one else in the world who could match her so perfectly. "I'm going to miss you, Joshua Goddard. Lord, take care of him and the entire Goddard family while I'm away. May your mercy and grace be upon them as they continue to mourn. May they see the light of your love even in these difficult times, and may you show them the way forward." She waved to Joshua one last time as the taxi drove off. The Goddards would be well. They had faith in God, and he would take care of them. Her family was the unknown quantity, and she had no idea what to expect when she arrived. Chapter 2. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. There was something in the air, a feeling deep inside her that for the past few days she'd been unable to shake. Maggie wasn't sure what it was, but this she knew. Something good was about to happen. A smile graced her lips as she unravelled the lights from the packaging in which they were stored. Christmas was her favourite time of year. And it was a big deal at Goddard Downs. It was a time when they got to take things a little slower, enjoy each other's company, and pull together to survive the harshness of the rainy season. This year, more than any other, the station needed that coming together. Julian's death was foremost in the minds of all, but after 4 months since his passing, the initial shock was wearing off, and everyone was coming to a sense of a new normal. However, this year's Christmas celebration would be different. This year, both hers and Frank's families would come together under one roof. Last year, her son Jeremy and his wife Emma had gone to Emma's parents, and Maggie's daughter Serena and Serena's new husband David had their own plans as newlyweds. This year, everyone was making an effort to be together. Maggie doubted that Julian would have ever anticipated his death could have such an effect on both his and her families. His passing had made everyone connected with him reassess their priorities and take stock of what and who was most important to them. Maggie certainly had, and she realised that despite the difficulties of life, she would rather go through those difficulties with family around her than suffer them alone. She rarely thought what it would be like to have her children under her roof again, since it was customary for children to grow up and move away. Except at Goddard Downs, where they grew up and returned. Or stayed put. If only she'd had such an opportunity to watch the lives of her children and grandchildren unfold before her, not as an observer from a distance. It's different for us than it is for you, Lord. You watch us from right beside us. We often think of you as being far off, but you aren't. You're right by our side, seeing everything we do. It doesn't matter how difficult the circumstance, how bitter the pain. You're always there, giving comfort and strength. Thank you, Lord, that we have this time to be together. To not only celebrate the birth of your son, but to celebrate the gift of family that you've given to us. Maggie lifted her gaze as the sound of a whirring engine grew louder, drowning out her thoughts. They were here. Pushing up from the floor, she made her way outside and raised a hand over her eyes as the helicopter hovered overhead. The sun was bright and the day hot, but not for long. In the distance, dark clouds filled the horizon. A storm was brewing, and the weather reports forecasted flash flooding. A warning had been issued only an hour earlier to the residents of the Kimberley. Maggie was glad that Serena and David had decided to come with baby Oliver before lunch and not in the afternoon. "Is that them?" Jeremy called from the doorway, 2-year-old Chloe on his hip. The child was sucking contently on a fruit bar, her little head nestled into the crook of his neck. "Yes," Maggie answered. Jeremy and Emma had arrived with the children 3 days earlier, and in that time they had made themselves completely at home at Goddard Downs. Janella, Julian's widow, was grateful for the extra hands in the kitchen. Since Julian's death, she wasn't much in the mood for cooking, but she continued in her duty, putting the needs of the family above her grief. Maggie hoped that with everyone there it would ease her pain further and return the smile that had been absent from her face too long. Maggie turned her gaze to the helicopter once more, It swayed sharply and her heart faltered for a moment, but there was nothing to worry about. Frank was skilled behind the stick of a helicopter and would get them safely to the ground. The second the rotors stopped spinning, Maggie rushed towards the helicopter. By the time she reached it, David and Frank had already jumped out, but Serena sat in the back, the small bundle that was Oliver curled securely against her body. "Welcome!" Maggie's greeting was bright as she stepped up and kissed Serena's cheek before stealing a peek at Oliver. He was dressed in a teddy bear onesie and made her go to mush. "He's so precious, sweetheart." "Tell me about it," Serena replied with a chuckle. "He keeps me up every night, but it's the best sleeplessness I've ever had." In her years as a journalist, Serena had experienced many sleepless nights while covering a story. And also when David was off fighting bushfires, putting himself on the line to save others. Maggie had suffered many of those nights with her. "Would you like me to take him?" "He's all yours." As Serena placed the sleeping baby in her arms, Maggie felt a rush of love as she smelled the sweet scent that all babies seemed to have. She liked to muse that it was the smell of innocence, though it was more likely due to the detergent their clothes were washed in. "Frank said a storm's expected tonight," Serena said as she stepped down from the helicopter. She'd put on some weight during her pregnancy and was currently the heaviest she'd ever been in her life, but it looked good on her. The added weight further softened her curves and gave a pleasant roundness to her face, filling out some of the permanent scars she carried from the blast in Paris. But what changed her appearance the most was the serenity Maggie noted in her eyes. "Yes, but don't worry. We get storms all the time during the rainy season, but I'm glad you arrived before it did. Getting caught in a storm isn't fun, especially in the helicopter." Serena laughed. "Listen to you. Don't you sound like a regular cattle station owner's wife?" Maggie chuckled. "Well, that's what I am." Mother and daughter exchanged smiles and laughter as Frank and David grabbed the bags and baby paraphernalia. "I'm so glad you're here, sweetheart." "And I'm glad to be here." Serena's expression grew serious. "How is everyone?" Maggie exhaled a slow breath. "Doing their best. We all miss Julian. Christmas won't be the same, but we're hoping to make the best of it for everyone's sake, especially for Caleb and Sasha." Maggie felt so much for the children, who'd not only witnessed their grandmother's drowning when they were younger, but more recently, their father's car crash that resulted in his death. Serena nodded as the two women proceeded to walk the short distance to the house. As they entered, Emma, who was sitting on the floor of the living room colouring with 4-year-old Sebastian, rose to her feet and threw her arms around Serena. "I'm so glad you got here before the storm arrived. I was worried you wouldn't make it." Serena returned her sister-in-law's hug. "Frank said we had plenty of time. The storm won't come this way for a few hours." "I know, but storms can be unpredictable. I feel better that you're here before it starts." Being a city girl, Emma was a little nervous about spending Christmas in a place that was only accessible by air during the wet season and was also prone to flooding, although Maggie had assured her several times there was nothing to worry about. The rest of the family gathered around David and Serena, but mostly they stood around Maggie, beaming at little Oliver. "He's beautiful, Serena. You should be so proud." Olivia, Frank's daughter, smiled as she lifted 5-year-old Isabel to look at the baby. "He's sleeping," Isabel said. "How can I play with him if he's sleeping?" Frank laughed from where he stood behind Maggie. "You can't play with him yet, Izzy. He's too small. When he gets a bit bigger." Isabel frowned. "Why do they always have to be so small? I don't like waiting." "Now, Isabel, what have I told you about patience?" Frank said, lifting a brow. Isabel didn't hesitate in her response. "A patient spirit is better than a proud spirit." "That's right," Frank replied, smiling. The others chuckled while Olivia stepped aside so Janella could greet Serena and the baby. The exchange between the pair was more subdued. A Christmas card had arrived the day before from one of Julian's school friends who hadn't heard the news of his passing, wishing them all a Merry Christmas and expressing hope at seeing them in the new year. The card's arrival had revived Janella's melancholy. With the greetings over, Maggie took Serena to the guest room that had been prepared for her, David, and baby Oliver. It was simply decorated in shades of white, pale blue, and green, with windows that opened onto the back of the house. Olivia had offered the use of William's old bassinet for Oliver, now he'd outgrown it. David and Frank left the bags in the corner of the room before returning to the living room and the rest of the family. Maggie settled Oliver into the bassinet before turning to help Serena with the unpacking. "Are you sure you want to do this now?" she asked. They'd only just arrived, and there'd be plenty of time to unpack later. "Yes, I get so tired that if I don't do it now, it might not get done until tomorrow," Serena answered, opening one of the cases. "I'd rather be settled sooner rather than later. It'll make things easier, especially when it comes to Oliver. Routine keeps me sane. Besides, I have some meetings scheduled in town and I want to get my clothes out and have them ready." Maggie marvelled at Serena's gusto. She had a small baby and was already gearing up for speaking engagements. Maggie should have known that she'd pursue this new career path with the same fervour she had journalism. She just didn't expect it to be so soon after Oliver's arrival. Couldn't David unpack? Serena rolled her eyes. David's great at a lot of things, but packing and unpacking is not his forte. If I left it to him, I wouldn't find anything. It's better for me to do it. Maggie chuckled at the little idiosyncrasies that made life and marriage interesting. Very well. At least I can help. It's faster with extra hands. Thanks, Mum. The pair was halfway through the first suitcase and Maggie was deciding on where to place Oliver's little shirts when she caught a sidelong glance from Serena. Her daughter had something to say, but was hesitating. "What is it, honey?" "Oh, nothing," Serena shrugged, quickly busying herself with the contents of the suitcase. Maggie stopped unpacking and studied her daughter, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not so sure about that." Serena turned and faced her. "I was just wondering how Janella and the children are coping. It must be so hard on them, especially now it's Christmas." Maggie nodded. "Yes, it's difficult for them. Janella puts on a brave face for the children's sake, but I can see the pain in her eyes. Caleb's taking it hard, as you'd expect. Sasha's grown quiet and stays even closer to her mother." Serena grimaced as she lifted a blouse from the suitcase. "I can't imagine how they must feel. We've never had anyone in our family die under such tragic circumstances, and now they've had two. It seems unfair." Maggie was silent. She wanted to tell Serena something encouraging, but she didn't have the words because she was thinking the same. It seemed unfair that the family had lost Esther, Frank's first wife, and now Julian. Why had God allowed it? Had they not prayed hard enough? She knew she should simply trust God and accept what happened as His will, but she was struggling. It seemed so unjust. "Mum?" Maggie snapped out of her thoughts. "Sorry, what did you say?" "Nothing, you were just quiet. I wasn't sure if you were all right." Maggie forced a smile. "Oh, I'm perfectly fine. Let's get this finished so we can get back to the family." "Okay. But Mum, I want you to know that we're praying for you. Julian's death must be hard on all of you." Hearing Serena speak so easily of prayer brought a tear to Maggie's eye. She was growing steadily in the Lord, and that made Maggie so happy. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me, and I'm sure it will mean a lot to Frank too." "It's nothing, Mum. After all the prayers you've raised on my behalf, praying for you is a very little thing." Maggie reached out her hand. "All the same, I'm grateful." Serena turned to her with glassy eyes. Taking Maggie's hand, she stepped closer and hugged her tight. "I love you, Mum." Maggie rubbed her daughter's back. "I love you too, sweetheart." It was true. Having a child changed you, and Serena had certainly changed. She was softer, more caring, and more open with her feelings. Watching her bloom gave Maggie great joy. They finished unpacking in record time, and after checking that Oliver was still asleep, the pair joined the family in the living room. Before entering, Maggie paused briefly in the doorway and took in the cosy scene. Seeing both families together like this warmed her heart so. Other than Julian, only Stella was missing. Although she technically wasn't part of the family, Maggie had high hopes for her and Joshua. She was good for him, and despite Frank's surprise over their relationship, he was happy about it and thought highly of her, although he wasn't sure it would last. Maggie, on the other hand, was confident it would. In fact, she sensed that Stella Martin was an answer to prayer. She stepped into the room and joined Frank. Whatever the Lord had in store for them, beside Frank was where she belonged. She wound her arm around her husband's and patted his forearm gently as he spoke to David. Despite the sadness, they would have a happy Christmas. Chapter 3. The following morning, Frank blinked in the dark, unfamiliar room. Where was he? Was he dreaming? No, he couldn't be. Maggie was beside him, sound asleep, and the warmth of her body was real against his. Slowly, he remembered where they were and why. The night before, Isabel and the other children had insisted that he and Maggie stay the night so they could all be together for Christmas morning. At first, Frank wasn't sure Maggie would be willing to give up the comfort of their bed to share an old cot in the guest room with Jeremy, Emma, and the children. But to his surprise, she'd agreed almost immediately. Raising his head, he peered around the darkened room. Only a crack of light filtered in through the blinds. They were alone. The others must have left while he and Maggie were still asleep, which meant it was time to get up. Reaching over, he kissed her on the cheek. "Wake up, darling. It's Christmas." She didn't stir at first, and Frank repeated the action, this time kissing her more earnestly. "Wakey, wakey. The children will be waiting for us to open their presents." It was a Goddard family tradition to rise early on Christmas morning and gather around the tree to share and open presents before breakfast, and on the rare occasion, when they could manage it, go to church. Church wasn't an option this year with so many of them, but it didn't mean they couldn't sing Christmas hymns and pray together to celebrate Christ's birth. "Maggie?" "I heard you," she replied huskily while stretching her arms. "How did it get to be morning so quickly? It seems like we just went to bed." Frank laughed, brushing a salt-coloured strand of hair from her face. She was beautiful, and he was so blessed to have her as his wife. "Small children can do that to old folks like us." Maggie's brows lifted as she pushed up on her elbows. "Speak for yourself, Frank Goddard. I am not an old folk." "Oh? And what do you say you are?" "Mature," she replied with a laugh, flopping back onto the pillow. Gazing into her eyes, he gently caressed her cheek before lowering his head and brushing her lips against hers. "Good morning, my love. Merry Christmas." Her eyes twinkled as she returned his smile. "Merry Christmas, Frank." He could have stayed there all day with her, but the moment was broken when Isabel's excited voice sounded outside the room. "Grandpa, wake up! It's Christmas!" A second later, she burst through the door with Olivia on her heels. "Isabel, no!" Olivia managed to grab her before casting an apologetic look at Frank and Maggie. "I'm sorry. I tried to stop her. She just got away from me." "It's all right," he replied. "We were getting up anyway." "Merry Christmas, Isabel," Maggie said. "I hope you had a good night's rest so you can open all your presents." "I did. Now can we open them, Mummy?" She looked up at her mother with expectant eyes. "Can we?" Grandpa and Grandma Maggie are up now. Soon, darling. Frank and Maggie laughed together. Grandma Maggie and I will be right out, he said before addressing Olivia. Tell everyone we'll be right there. Olivia nodded. I will. I'm very sorry she disturbed you. It's fine, love. That's why we stayed here, so the children could wake us. Okay, I'll let everyone know you're coming. Frank grinned as Olivia and Isabel left the room. Maggie chuckled. I think we embarrassed her. Do you think so? Slipping his arms around her, Frank eased Maggie's head against the pillow and planted a kiss on her lips. I don't know how. I don't know either. Laughing, she wriggled from his hold and swung her legs onto the floor. Time to get up. Frank nodded. She was right. They couldn't make the family wait any longer. Pushing to his feet, he stretched and slipped on his brown robe, tying the cord in a knot at his waist while Maggie headed to the bathroom down the hall. As he followed and waited outside, the sounds of laughter echoed from the living area and brought a smile to his lips until the photo of him, Esther, and their 3 children taken not long before she died caught his eye. The heaviness of heart that had been with him almost incessantly since Julian's passing returned. Death was a part of life, but his son had been taken too early, as had Esther. He didn't understand why, and deep down he knew he never would, at least not until his own time came and he could ask God face to face. But even then, what right did he have to question God? Whatever the reason, his ways were higher, and all Frank could do was trust him and appreciate those around him now, like the children and Maggie. As she stepped out of the bathroom, his heart swelled with gratitude. God had blessed him greatly with a second love. Not everyone got that. Smiling, he stepped towards her and kissed her gently on the top of her head. You look lovely, my dear. Her forehead creased with amusement. Thank you, but I didn't do anything special, just brushed my teeth and smoothed my hair. It doesn't matter. You always look beautiful. Chuckling, she shook her head. You're such a romantic, Frank Goddard. Come on, we'd best not keep the children waiting any longer. She linked her arm through his and together they walked down the hallway. The entire family was in the living room. The children were seated around the pine tree that was covered in colourful ornaments of all shapes and sizes. Underneath the boughs were colourfully wrapped gifts, and at the very top, a star. Taking in the scene, memories of many other Christmas mornings flashed through his mind. Pain stabbed his chest as his gaze settled on Janella and the children. There was no Julian this year. His son would never see another Christmas. He licked his lips and battered away the tears that stung his eyes. This wasn't the time for tears. This was a happy day. A day to remember the goodness of God and the mercy and love he showed in sending his son to save mankind. It wasn't a day to mourn. There had been enough of that. Today, they would rejoice. They had each other and would make the most of that. Taking a jagged breath, he smiled and shouted, Merry Christmas, everyone! Merry Christmas, the family chorused, turning in his and Maggie's direction. There were smiles on all their faces, except one, Janella's. Frank prayed that the day and gathering of the family would bring a smile to her face. But as she sat with an arm wrapped around each of her children, there was no sign of it. Soon, Janella. I pray your smile will return soon. He weaved his way across the room to his favourite chair which the others had left vacant for him. Maggie sat on his lap since all the other chairs were taken. He didn't mind in the least as she snuggled against him. The small children opened their presents with glee. There was something for everyone. Even little Oliver had a collection of gifts waiting for him. Maggie delighted in her purchases, and as she moved to the floor to sit with the children to open them, he couldn't help but think once more how blessed he was. Laughter filled the room as the kids played with their toys. Frank stood and weaved his way through the bodies, toys and paper to the side buffet where he poured 2 glasses of juice, one for him and one for Maggie. He also grabbed a handful of the Christmas cookies Janella had made. As he was returning to his chair, Serena called across the room. "Frank, where did you get these ornaments? I asked Mum, but she didn't know. I especially love this one with the reindeer on it." The room instantly grew quiet. Serena looked around, her eyes wide. "Did I say something wrong?"
"No," Frank assured her. "It's just that Julian made that ornament when he was 10. His mother liked personalising ornaments as she thought it made the season more festive. After we made them, we'd vote on whose was the best. Julian won that year."
His words dropped like stones into the suddenly silent room. Janella hugged Sasha to her side when she sniffled. Caleb hung his head. Serena looked guilty. This wasn't what he wanted.
"Has everyone had one of these cookies?" he asked, trying his best to change the solemn direction the morning had taken. "They're delectable, as usual."
He smiled warmly at Janella. "Can I get the recipe?" Emma asked. "They're so yummy, and since we can't be here every year, it'd be great to make them at home." "Who says you can't be here every year?" Olivia asked. "All you have to do is come. The doors are always open and you're more than welcome." The mood slowly lifted as the women continued their conversation. It wasn't long before Olivia's husband, Nathan, and David started their own discussion. Joshua stood behind Janella and the children and whispered something to Caleb. The boy looked up with a nod before getting to his feet. A moment later, the pair was standing by the piano. "Everyone, Caleb's going to play for us. I think a little music is just the thing to get this celebration going." Joshua smiled and patted Caleb's shoulder. "Rock it, kid." Caleb began to play the piano, and everyone sat quietly while he played a number of traditional Christmas songs. Frank was eager to hear him, but he wasn't prepared for him to play the song Julian used to play nearly every Christmas when he was a lad. Julian hadn't always been the serious man he'd grown into. When he was young, he was a playful and fun-loving boy who made ornaments and learned the piano under his mother's tutelage. Every year he'd amuse them in song as they sang along to their favourite Christmas carols. Then he grew up, and somewhere along the line he began to believe that fun was no longer part of his life. He had to be serious. He had to be dependable. Amusement and music were not part of that. It was too much. As Caleb played the little drummer boy, tears Frank had tried to hold back would no longer be restrained. They beat angry, anguished fists against the lids of his eyes until he could no longer control them, and they began trickling down his cheek. He had to get out of there. He couldn't spoil the family's entertainment with his sorrow. Seeking refuge, he escaped to the kitchen while everyone else remained in the living room, entranced by Caleb's rendition of the beautiful carol. Gripping the edge of the counter for support, Frank's knuckles turned white as he bit back sobs. Julian was dead. His firstborn was gone. Sobs racked his body, and in the silence of the kitchen they were deafening.
"Lord, why did you take my son? Why didn't you spare him? I know you have your reasons and your thoughts and ways are higher than mine and that there's some greater purpose to this, but I can't see it."
His sobs intensified as he slid to the floor.
"I can't see it, Lord. It hurts so much."
He gulped in air. Is this what God felt when Jesus died on the cross? Was that why he looked away, because it was too much to bear?
"You know how I feel, Lord. Help me endure this."
Moments passed, and slowly his sobs subsided.
"Lord, help me find solace and joy in the midst of this sadness. Make Julian's death mean something. He left with so much undone, so much unsaid. Help me live my life to the full and cherish each second of it."
"Frank?" He quickly wiped his face with the back of his hand before lifting his gaze. Maggie stood in the doorway, her face distraught as she hurried to him. He couldn't hide his heartache any longer.
I miss him, Maggie. I miss him so much.
She folded him into her arms. I know, my love. I know you do. She rubbed his back and held him tight. I miss him too. I may not have known him that long, but I loved him. He was like a son to me.
Frank nodded. He had his faults, but he was changing. He would have become that loving and openly affectionate person again if he'd had the time.
Pulling a tissue from his pocket, he blew his nose.
I could see it happening as he worked on that old truck with Caleb.
A fresh sob caught in Frank's throat as he pictured the two of them working together in the shed.
I shouldn't have let him take over the station so soon. He wasn't ready. I think that caused all the trouble between him and Joshua.
You can't blame yourself, Frank. Julian was an adult, but regardless of his faults, everyone loved him, including Joshua. Frank nodded. Maggie was right. He couldn't blame himself for Julian's faults, nor for the issues between him and Joshua. Drawing a slow breath, he rose to his feet as Olivia's head appeared in the doorway. Dad? Oh, there you are. I'm looking for the photo album from that year when we all went to New Zealand. Do you know where it is? Maggie squeezed his hand, and once again her strength allowed him to move beyond his grief.
I do,
he replied, his voice brighter.
It's in the hall closet. I'll help you find it.
He left Maggie and crossed the room to where Olivia stood. She meant the world to him, but he didn't say it often enough. Placing his hands on her shoulders, he looked into her eyes.
I love you, Olivia. You know that, don't you?
Her brows scrunched as she nodded. Yes, Dad. Of course I do.
Good,
he said softly as he slipped his arm across her shoulders.
Let's go find that album.
Chapter 4. The Hallelujah chorus resonated in the small chapel in Cootamundra where Stella was attending Christmas morning service. She raised her hands in worship and closed her eyes as she basked in the presence of God, although it saddened her that she was there on her own. Her parents were only getting out of bed when she left, having turned down the invitation to attend with her. She couldn't force them to go. She knew that, but it still saddened her. Lord, I pray that as my family gathers today, they might be aware of the great love you showed when you sent your son to earth as a baby. May they see beyond the turkey and the frivolity and see you. Let this day be one of fellowship and peace as we not only enjoy each other's company, but celebrate the birth of your son. In Jesus' precious name. Amen. The music faded and the congregation took their seats as the minister approached the pulpit. Although elderly, he spoke with conviction and zeal as he presented the Christmas message. Stella would never tire of hearing about God's amazing love, of how Jesus humbled himself and gave up everything to become a perfect sacrifice so that she, and anyone who believed, could be washed clean from sin and have the hope of eternal life with God. It was mind-blowing that he would do this when he knew that so many would reject him. Amazing grace! How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. Once the service was over, Stella hurried back to help with the lunch preparations. As she opened the door of the old weatherboard house and walked inside, the smell of roast turkey drifting down the hallway greeted her. Mum, Dad, I'm back, she called out. In the kitchen, her mum replied. Can you come and help? Your Auntie Judy was supposed to be here, but she called to say she'd been held up. Stella glanced at her watch. It was almost 11 and everyone was arriving at 12. I'll be right there. She rushed to her room to change. With all the family gathering for Christmas for the first time in many years, her mother was keen to make the event memorable, especially after the family had generously allowed them to move into Stella's grandmother's house when they returned to the town her mother had grown up in, penniless and jobless, after the bank foreclosed on Indigo Downs. The house had sat vacant for many years and was in a state of disrepair, but the family agreed that if they fixed it up, they could live there at least until they became financially stable. Although much work was still needed, her parents had made it livable. Stella slipped out of her burgundy lace dress and into a pair of denim capri and a red and white striped blouse before rushing to the kitchen. "Where do you need me?" "Right here," her mother replied. There was an edge to her voice and Stella sensed she was stressed. "Can you get the turkey out and baste it, and then can you chop the last of these vegetables?" "Sure, no worries, Mum. Is Dad carving the turkey?" Stella asked as she pulled the large bird from the oven. It was such a pity she was a vegetarian because it smelled so good, even making her stomach rumble. "Is that your stomach, Stella?" "Sorry, Mum, I didn't eat this morning. I didn't want to be late for church." Her mother's gaze narrowed as she stirred a large pot of gravy. "I don't understand how you can go out without eating. What if you'd collapsed and hurt yourself?" Stella resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Why did her mother always have to jump to the worst-case scenario? "I'm perfectly fine, Mum, just a little hungry." "I hope you look after yourself better while you're working. I'm sure they wouldn't want to medevac you out if you passed out because you were malnourished," her mother retorted. Stella blinked. Medevac her out? What was her mum talking about? But then the penny dropped. She was still upset about losing their home and livelihood. Stella's employment at Goddard Downs was almost like rubbing the loss in her face because they'd survived while Indigo had gone under. "Mum, I have to work. And I do take care of myself, honestly. You don't have to worry about me." Her mum stopped stirring and expelled a deep breath. "I'm sorry you had to go elsewhere to find work." She glanced at Stella over her shoulder. "I'm glad you found a job, Stell. I really am. I just hoped we'd be able to stay together as a family. Now we're down here and you're up there. You spent most of your childhood away from us, and now it feels like nothing has changed." "Oh, Mum." Stella left the turkey and embraced her. "I'm sorry it happened, but you and Dad are doing so well here. You've got the teacher aide job and Dad's got the position at the council, and you've done an amazing work on this house. Lord, let my words be encouraging." "Yes, we've been fortunate. I'm sorry for sounding so negative, love." "It's okay. I know it hasn't been easy." Her mum resumed her stirring. "Maybe it was for the best." Stella nodded. Maybe it was. Her parents certainly seemed much happier. By the time the rest of the family started to arrive, the cooking was complete and the tables on the back patio were set. Because her mum had been so busy preparing the food, she hadn't decorated the area, so Stella quickly put up some tinsel and placed a small, ornamental Christmas tree on the table the food would be served from. The patio had been recently painted and it looked great, much better than Stella remembered it looking when she'd visited as a youngster. Uncle Paul, her mother's younger brother, arrived first with his wife, Aunt Janice, and their 2 teenage daughters, who he introduced as Christine and Lucy. Of the 5 Abernathy siblings, Uncle Paul and her mother looked the most alike with their straight, dark hair, hazel eyes, and tapered noses. He kissed her cheek as he entered the house, a covered dish in his hands. "Merry Christmas, Stella. You look wonderful. I can't believe how grown up you are." "Thank you, Uncle Paul. You look well yourself. Can I take this from you?" She reached for the dish. "Sure," he said, handing it to her. "It's the sweet potato cheese pie your Aunt Janice is known for. She wasn't sure what to make." "It smells wonderful. I look forward to trying it." As the 2 girls walked in the door behind their parents, Stella greeted them warmly, exchanging hugs as best she could with the dish in her hands. "Come in while I take this to the kitchen." The family continued to arrive in a steady stream, the house filling to overflowing within an hour. Stella couldn't believe how many family members she had, and how few she actually knew. She had more cousins than she could count, but growing up as they had, they may as well have lived on different planets. She felt strange being with them. Those her age lived mainly in town. Some had jobs, others were unemployed. They marvelled that she was a qualified vet. Most didn't understand the draw of living off the land and herding livestock for sale. She felt out of place and missed the wide-open spaces of Goddard Downs. And Joshua. Her father called everyone to attention with the ringing of her grandmother's bell. Stella recalled her grandmother doing the very same thing many years before on one of her family's rare treks down south to Cootamundra. Stella would only have been 5 or 6 at the time, and she thought it a fun way to gather everyone together. It was a pity her grandmother wasn't here today to see all the family gathered together. It was a squeeze on the patio, and some of the smaller children had to sit on their parents' laps, but after everyone was settled, her father stood and waited for the noise to subside. Despite the heat of the day, he was wearing a purple sweater vest over a short-sleeved white shirt. His thinning hair was swept to one side to cover the growing bald spot, and he shuffled from one foot to the other while visibly gulping. Stella's heart went out to him. This wasn't his family. It was her mother's. And some of them hadn't been too happy when he'd whisked her away as a teenage bride and headed north to chase his dream of being a cattle baron. How humiliated he must have felt to return after losing Indigo. Yet here he was, standing before the family, about to welcome them to Christmas. A wave of pride surged through her that he could still hold his head high. He cleared his throat before he began. Thank you all for coming. It means the world to Gloria and me that you're here. It's a special day, and although it's a tight fit out here, we're glad to see you all. He looked down at her mum and placed his hand on her shoulder. We also want to say thank you for the welcome we received when we returned. We're grateful to have this old house to live in, and we're glad we could fix it up so we can gather together like we're doing right now. Merry Christmas, everyone. Let's dig in before the flies do. Everyone laughed, and then the older folks and those with small children went first to fill their plates. The remainder sat or stood and chatted with each other while waiting their turn. As Stella stood in the open doorway surveying the scene, a smile inched across her face. Despite missing everyone at Goddard Downs, she was glad she came. Chapter 5. There was no end of surprises that day, Stella discovered, as her family settled into the meal and began to share stories from the past few years. There'd been marriages, divorces, and remarriages, but the standout was Aunt Claudia, who'd recently married for the 4th time. Her current husband wasn't with her, as he'd opted to spend Christmas skiing the slopes in Switzerland with his teenage daughter from his 2nd marriage. Although her aunt didn't seem bothered, Stella wondered if the marriage would last. As one of her cousins told the story of how Aunt Claudia met her current husband when she was stuck with him in an elevator for 3 hours, Stella tried to hide her grin behind a spoonful of pavlova, but her aunt caught her. And what are you grinning about, Stella? We've heard from almost everyone at the table but you. Anyone special in your life? All gazes swung to her as she momentarily froze. Was she prepared to share her new relationship with them? What she and Joshua felt for each other seemed too precious to talk about, at least not yet. And not with people she didn't really know, even if they were family. But how could she, in all honesty, say there wasn't anyone special? Smiling, she shook her head and prayed that God and Joshua would forgive her. Not really. I don't believe that for a second. That grin meant something. You just don't want to share, her aunt challenged with a laugh. All right, have your secrets. I had plenty of them when I was your age. Stella said nothing but turned in her parents' direction. Her father was focused on his bowl of pavlova, but her mother was looking at her thoughtfully. Stella smiled and her mother smiled back as the conversations continued. By the time the stars were out, Stella felt at home amidst her family. She got to know her cousins better, and despite their differences, They found some common ground in movies, books, and music. Sadly, it seemed that none of her family shared her beliefs, although she couldn't be sure of that without talking with all of them. Even then, she knew that people often weren't comfortable talking about what they believed, especially with someone they didn't know. It was far easier to stick with less contentious topics. However, on the surface, it appeared she was on her own. Her own faith had come from her paternal grandmother, with whom she'd lived with on and off for years while Stella was sick. She sometimes wondered what had made her father walk away from faith when his own mother was such a devout believer. But she had hope that one day he'd return. Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. It seemed that no one had taught her mother's family about God. From the little she'd said, Stella gleaned that her mother's early childhood was riddled with abuse and poverty. Her grandfather was a drunk who beat her grandmother for no reason at all, and since he was unable to keep a job, the family struggled to make ends meet. Her grandmother, however, did what she could to ensure the children never went hungry and did her best to protect them from their abusive father. After Stella's grandfather passed away from cirrhosis of the liver in his early 40s, her grandmother devoted herself to giving her 5 children the best life possible. Stella's mum was 10 when he died. Her grandmother, whose house they were now in, passed away 6 years ago at the age of 73. Looking at the extended family, Stella was sure her grandmother would be proud at how they'd all turned out. They were good people. They just didn't know God. She prayed once more that while they were celebrating Christmas, her parents in particular might appreciate the real meaning of the holiday and open their hearts to him. That would be the best Christmas present ever. The house was finally quiet. Midnight was almost upon them, and Stella and her mother were in the kitchen washing dishes. Her father was outside tidying the patio. While Stella scraped leftovers into the bin, she glanced at her mum, who was elbows deep in suds. "I enjoyed seeing everyone today," she said. "Yes, it was a wonderful day. I'm already looking forward to doing it again next year." "Really? You think you'll stay here?" "Yes." Her mum stopped washing and turned around, a gleam on her face. "This is the happiest we've been in a long time. I'm sure you saw what the stress of running Indigo was doing to Dad." Stella nodded. It was slowly destroying him. "It put our marriage under pressure, and then I was angry at him for losing the station. But since we've been here and we haven't had that weight pressing down on us, things have turned around and we're happy again." The shimmer in her mother's eyes pushed Stella forward. She wrapped her arms around her in a long hug. "I'm so glad for you, Mum. For you and Dad." "Thank you, sweetheart." Her mother's voice faltered as she patted Stella gently on the back. "We've got to start over, love. Not every couple gets that chance." Stella laughed to herself. She'd been so determined to get Indigo back for her parents, but God already had a plan for them. They were doing so much better than they had at Indigo. If she'd succeeded in getting it back, she would have only caused them more stress and worry. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for knowing better than me and for doing exactly what you needed to do. I pray that this change will open my parents' hearts to you and to your love, that they'll see this as you at work in their lives and not simply as a random set of events." "And what about you, Stella?" She released her mother and stepped back. "Me?" "Yes, what about you? How are you adjusting to the change of being somewhere else, of letting go of Indigo? I know you were upset when we lost it." She leaned back against the counter and folded her arms. "As you said, I had to let go." She smiled wistfully. It was for the best. Nodding, her mother returned to the dishes. "Running a station is difficult these days. At least you were able to find a job. It's just a pity it's so far away." "I couldn't have asked for a better position, Mum. The Goddards have accepted me and I feel like part of their family. Frank, Maggie, Olivia and Nathan, Janella and the children. Joshua?" Her cheeks warmed at the mention of his name, and again she found herself smiling. Her mother glanced her way, a lopsided grin on her face. "There it is." "What?" "What your aunt was saying at lunch. That smile, I see it now. So there is someone special." Stella's hands dropped to her sides. "Is it that obvious?" Her mother chuckled. "A little." A groan mingled with a laugh escaped from Stella as she shifted her weight from one leg to the other. I didn't want to say anything." Her mother left the dishes and turned around. "So, who is he?" Stella held her mother's gaze, her stomach flipping like she was a teenager again. "Joshua Goddard." "Frank's youngest." Stella nodded. "We've been seeing each other for 4 months, ever since his brother passed away." Her mother's lips twisted in sympathy. "Oh, I'm so sorry for them. I can only imagine how difficult that must have been for Frank and the family after losing Esther a few years ago. It's so very sad." "It was. It is." Her mum returned to the dishes while Stella waited for her to say something about her announcement. She assumed she'd be happy, relieved even, to hear she was dating, although she might not be too happy to hear it was Joshua Goddard. "Is it serious?" she finally asked. Because she didn't look around, Stella was unable to tell from her facial expression what her thoughts were, but her tone was ominously neutral. Stella's lips parted, but nothing came out. Was it serious? She thought of Joshua constantly. She looked forward to seeing him every day. They seemed to fit in a way she never had with anyone before. Yet, did that make it serious? What qualified a relationship as serious? Time? Understanding? She wasn't sure. Besides, she didn't know if Joshua's feelings ran that deep. He was still dealing with Julian's death. She hardly thought he was considering the depth of his feelings for her at this point. "We're taking it slowly." Her mother nodded. "Good. He's grieving. That makes a person vulnerable to making decisions they might not make if they were thinking rationally." Stella bristled. What was her mother suggesting? "Are you saying that Joshua is dating me out of some kind of coping mechanism?" Her mother faced her. "I wasn't saying that. I'm sorry if you took it that way. I'm sure that if Joshua chose to date you, it was because he has true feelings for you, not because he's using you to make himself feel better. I didn't mean for it to come out that way. Forgive me." Stella nodded. Joshua didn't want her in his life to fill the hole that Julian's death had made. She believed that. He'd wanted more between them long before she agreed to the relationship. Since Alice Springs, he'd wanted to date her, but she'd refused. Still, something inside her wondered. Could there be some truth to what her mother said? "What do you feel for him?" The comforting voice and her mother's question distracted her from the earlier remark. How did she feel about Joshua? "I like him very much." "Just like?" Her mother's brow lifted as bubbles from the tub rose before her face. Stella chuckled. "I more than like him," she admitted, as longing filled her heart. "I feel very deeply for him, Mum. More than I've ever felt for anyone else." "Is that so?" "Yes. He's not perfect by any degree, but the more we get to know each other, and the more I learn about him, the more perfect he seems to be for me." "Is that crazy?" Her mother chortled. "Oh, not at all. Sometimes you just know." "Know what?" Stella's stomach began to knot. This wasn't the conversation she'd intended to have, but they were having it. She only hoped she wasn't setting herself up for disappointment. That she wasn't reading more into the relationship than there was, more than Joshua was able to give. "The right person for you. I knew it with your father, and despite our ups and downs, I wouldn't want to be sharing my life with anyone else." Stella's heart jumped inside her chest. Was she in love with Joshua in the way her parents loved each other? The forever kind of love? Was she ready for that type of commitment? was Joshua? She remained thoughtful as she packed up the rest of the food. She thought she'd learned something from talking to her mother, but instead, she'd ended up with more questions. Chapter 6. Frank knew that Christmas would be challenging. He knew there'd be sadness over Julian's death, but never did he imagine the degree of pain his son's absence would have on him. His heart ached through the morning and the opening of the presents. It ached through the saying of grace and lunch. Last year, Julian had said it. It ached as they sat that night and he read the Bible to everyone, recounting the story of the Saviour's birth. Now, days later, it still ached. But listening to the gentle timbre of Maggie's breaths as she slept with her head on his shoulder, he remembered there was a season for everything. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to uproot. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to heal. When would that time arrive? When would the aching stop? When would the tears stop flowing? When would the memories of his son stop eliciting more pain than joy?
I should have done better by Julian. I should have done more to stop my sons from squabbling. Perhaps none of this would have happened if I'd listened more. Joshua mightn't have been as unsettled and Julian might still be alive.
Frank took a deep breath while gently rubbing Maggie's arm. What would happen now? He'd already accepted that he'd have to take back responsibility for the station, at least until Joshua showed signs of wanting to run it, although Frank had doubts that would ever happen. He lowered his gaze to Maggie's sleeping form. They'd have to put their travel plans on hold. She wouldn't like it, but she'd be good about it. It was her nature. She understood things, and he was glad of that. Some wives wouldn't understand. His fingers found themselves entangled in the silken tresses of her hair before he kissed her on the forehead. She didn't stir, not that he wanted her to. He was enjoying the silence and that steady rhythm of her breathing. However, her serenity wasn't to last. A few minutes later, the firm knock of a strong hand against their front door woke her and set Frank on his feet. Who could it be at this hour? He checked the clock to make sure his watch was right. It was not yet 6 a.m. "Who is it, Frank?" Maggie asked in a groggy voice, wiping the sleep from her eyes before raising her arms above her head to stretch. Frank looked at her and shrugged. "I don't know. I'll go check." He headed to the door and, pulling back the curtain, peeked out the window. Joshua stood outside in the pale light of early morning, head down and hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his jeans. Frank called back, "It's Joshua." He turned the lock and opened the door. "Good morning, son. What brings you here this time of day?" "I know it's early, but can I come in?" "Sure." Frank's brows came together as he stepped aside to let Joshua pass. "Is something wrong?" "Not really. I just couldn't sleep." Joshua headed for the living room where Maggie now sat on the couch wrapped in her robe. Frank followed, a twinge of concern gnawing at his gut. It was never a good thing when people came by at such an hour. Surely there was no more bad news to be had. But still, he steeled himself. "Good morning, Maggie." Joshua tipped his hat before removing it and placing it on the side table. "I'm sorry to stop by so early, but I needed to talk to Dad." "It's fine, Joshua. I'm sure you wouldn't be here if it wasn't important. I'll leave the two of you alone," she replied, getting to her feet. "You can stay. It might be good for you to hear this as well. You could help." Frank's eyes widened. Joshua wanted to talk and was willing to allow Maggie in on the conversation? That was a first. Even more curious was the fact that he was asking for help. His son, who did everything on his own and marched to his singular drum, was coming to them for help. Frank groaned. He had to be in trouble. Why else would he come asking for help? "If that's the case, let's all sit down." Frank sat beside Maggie while Joshua pulled one of the single chairs closer to the couch. Frank remained silent as his son leaned over, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands folded together. Frank tried to ignore the thundering of his heart as he imagined the worst. Maggie, as if sensing his distress, took hold of his hand and squeezed it gently. She said she'd go through anything with him. Frank was sure that her words were about to be put to the test. "Dad, Maggie, I have something I need to say to you. I don't know how you'll take it or if you'll approve, but I've made a decision and I want you to be the first to know." Frank's brows knitted. "A decision?" "Yes, a decision about my future," Joshua replied, his hands locked together so tightly his knuckles were white. Frank exchanged a glance with Maggie before he swung his gaze back to Joshua. Perhaps he wasn't in trouble after all. Maybe he was simply planning on leaving. If that was the case, they'd deal with it. It would mean Frank and Maggie would be tied to the station a lot longer than expected since he didn't trust non-family members to run the business, but they'd manage. His gaze held firmly as he asked, "What have you decided, son?" Joshua's Adam's apple bobbed as he spoke. He looked downright uncomfortable. "You know that Stella and I have been seeing each other these past few months?" Frank nodded, his eyes narrowing. Joshua moved forward in his seat. "What you don't know is how serious I am about her. With everything that's happened, I realise how short life is and how precious. I don't want to waste it, Dad. I feel as if I've wasted so much already and I don't want to do that anymore. I want to choose what happens next, not wait for it to sneak up on me." Frank's brow furrowed further. "What are you saying, son?" Joshua straightened, his jaw firming. "I'm saying that I want to marry her. I love her, and I know she loves me. I don't want to waste any more time when I already know what I want." Maggie gasped, but Frank was too stunned to speak. Marriage? He searched the depth of his son's gaze and found determination staring back at him. His son had come prepared for opposition and looked ready to defend himself. But he didn't need to. Frank wouldn't fight him. Not this time. "Marriage is a great commitment, son. Are you certain this is what you want?" "Yes, Dad. I know you think I'm too irresponsible, but Julian's death changed me. I just want to be sure you've thought this through." "I have." Their gazes remained locked until Frank reached out and shook Joshua's hand. "Then I'm happy for you." Joshua blinked as Maggie laughed and congratulated him. "You've made a wonderful choice. Stella's a great girl." "She is," Frank agreed. "She's been an asset to this place since the day she began. She's filled the vet's shoes better than anyone could have imagined. I'm happy with her work and would be happy to see her added to the family." Leaning back, Joshua dispelled a long breath. "I'm so relieved. I thought you'd try to stop me since we haven't been dating long." Frank shook his head. "Why would I do that? You're a grown man, Joshua. You can make decisions for yourself. You don't need me to approve." If Frank wasn't mistaken, Joshua's eyes misted over. He quickly swiped them with the back of his hand, as if embarrassed. "You really mean that?" "Of course. I trust you, Joshua. I may not have always said it, but I do. I'm sorry if I didn't tell you enough or if I made you feel I didn't trust you. I never meant to." The words slipped unbidden from his lips. He was sorry for many things, but at least God was giving him the chance to correct some of them. Perhaps this would be the start of the healing process between him and his son. Joshua's voice cracked as he said, "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." Maggie squeezed Frank's arm and smiled brightly. "This is wonderful news, Joshua. Goddard Downs needs something to celebrate." "Oh yes, I agree," Frank said. "When do you plan on telling the others?" Joshua raked his fingers through his dark hair. "As soon as I ask Stella." The three laughed together. "That would be a good idea," Frank said. "Does she know how deeply you feel?" "I think so. I hope so. I want to propose when she gets back from Cootamundra. I just need to buy a ring." "Picking an engagement ring is a big deal. Do you have anything in mind?" Frank asked. Not really. I don't know much about these things, Joshua admitted. Then why don't you let Maggie help you with that? Frank took her hand and patted it. I'm sure she can help you find the perfect ring for Stella. Maggie's eyes widened and Frank gulped. I should have asked first, love, but you'd be willing to help Joshua out, wouldn't you? Joshua leaned forward. You don't have to if it's too much trouble, but I'd greatly appreciate it if you could. She diffused the tension with a smile. Of course I will, Joshua. I'd be pleased to help, and it'll give us a chance to spend some time together. I'll look forward to that. Relief washed over his face. Thank you. Frank sat quietly watching the exchange between his wife and son. This was a good thing, an opportunity for the pair to get to know each other better. Of all the members of his family, Joshua interacted with Maggie the least. Frank wasn't sure if it had to do with his busy schedule or whether there was something more. Whatever the reason, they now had a chance to spend some time together and see if there wasn't more that connected them besides him. He still wasn't sure whether this was the start of their time to heal or if he was rushing it, but Frank wanted Joshua to settle. If Stella was the person to lead him towards that, then he'd welcome her happily into the family. I should probably get going since I've got a busy day, Joshua said as he pushed to his feet. Maggie stood beside him. Let me know when you want to go ring hunting. He nodded. Perhaps later this week? Sounds fine to me, she replied. Then it's a date. Joshua grinned and headed to the door. After he left, Maggie slipped her arms around Frank's waist and gazed up at him. That was a surprise. He chuckled. Oh, you can say that again. That evening, as the two of them settled in for a cup of tea and Sasha's freshly baked cookies after dinner, he still couldn't believe Joshua's news. He bit into the cookie, its crispy edge giving way to a moist, chewy centre. His granddaughter had her mother's talents in the kitchen, though in a different vein. While Janella was a master at cooking, Sasha was proving herself to be quite a baker. Since her father's death, she'd spent more and more time in the kitchen beside her mother, and each time she created something delectable. I'm sure I've gained a few pounds from Sasha's baking, Frank commented as he sank his teeth into another cookie. Whether you did or not, it doesn't really matter. Maggie groaned as she took another bite herself. These are so good. Frank agreed with a hum, his mouth too full to respond. He settled back in his seat and followed up the morsel with a sip of tea. How are you feeling? Maggie asked quietly. He turned to her. He knew what she meant, and like the amazing woman she was, she knew that his mind was still reeling without him having to say so. I'm not sure. It was a bit of a shock. I know I was surprised. It was. But if Joshua's happy, then I'm happy. Maggie studied him closely, her gaze narrowing. Are you? Frank expelled a heavy breath. I truly am. There's no denying that he's made his share of mistakes. We all have. I can't keep holding those mistakes against him. I need to give him space and trust him like I said. I think I've treated him like a child for too long. You don't think he's rushing it? Frank gave a small shrug. Maybe. It's only been 4 months since Stella arrived, but in that time she's proven herself to be level-headed and dependable. Not to mention she loves the Lord. And since she's been in his life, Joshua's had more of an inclination towards God than he has since his mother's death. I think that says something. Maggie nodded. She's a very good influence on him. That she is. Frank expelled another long breath. I think for the first time I understand where Joshua is right now. He's realised that nothing's guaranteed, and he doesn't want to waste the chances he gets. I felt the same when you and I met. He leaned over and planted a kiss on the side of her head. How can I not support him? Maggie snuggled against him. I hope they'll be happy together. I just hope Stella says yes. Frank blinked. He hadn't thought of that. What if Stella didn't share Joshua's feelings? Had his son thought of that? A sudden pain pierced his chest. He rubbed the left side, hoping to dispel it. Are you okay, Frank? Maggie lifted her head, her face etched with worry. A little heartburn, I think. She frowned. You did have 2 helpings of that curry and it was very spicy. I'll get some baking soda water. She stood, and despite the pain, Frank grabbed her hand. Her face pinched with concern. What's the matter, Frank?
Nothing. I just wanted to tell you how much I love you.
She chuckled. I love you too. But let me get that baking soda water. And what about another pot of tea, perhaps chamomile this time? Frank grinned and set his mug aside.
That sounds wonderful. I think I might have overdone the decadence for one day.
Perhaps we both did. She gave another small chuckle as she headed for the kitchen. I'll be right back.
Good. I'm not going anywhere.
Chapter 7. Maggie's hands were clammy as she dressed to meet Joshua for their trip to Kununurra. It was the first time she and her stepson would be alone together, and although it was a chance to get to know one another, which Maggie wanted, she was also a little anxious. Following her divorce, she didn't expect to remarry, let alone consider she'd ever become a stepmother. Yet here she was, married to the most wonderful man and a stepmother to 3. She quickly corrected herself. Stepmother to 2, now that Julian was gone. Not that she could ever take Esther's place. She didn't want to. But being married to their father meant she was part of the family. While Olivia and Janella had welcomed her and made her feel she belonged, the boys had never really taken to her. In fact, she was sure that at times her presence was resented. She could still remember the look on Julian's face when she tried to intercede in his argument with Joshua. Joshua was a different matter altogether. Other than his spats with Julian, he rarely showed emotion. Therefore, she had no idea what he was thinking. Despite what he'd said, she wasn't sure that he truly wanted her to go with him that day and had agreed simply to please his father. Lord, help me today. Bless this outing and help Joshua and me to find a middle ground, to accept one another in whatever capacity. He may not see me as a mother figure, but I pray he'll allow me to be his friend. We all need each other following Julian's death. As we try to move forward and rebuild, I pray that you'll be with us and that you'll give us peace amidst our sorrow. Help us to be there for each other. In Jesus' precious name, Amen. She tugged in her earrings to pull the hoops into their proper place before leaving the bedroom. Frank was already gone since he had an early morning call with Ravi Tamala. The negotiations were proceeding well, and Maggie expected that very soon things would be settled and the station would be supplying the extra beef to Ravi's enterprise. In the meantime, discussions were being held amongst the family to ensure everyone was comfortable with the arrangements, and when necessary, adjustments were made. However, the main issue was still figuring out how they could accommodate a larger herd without sacrificing quality. They could easily run more cattle, but Frank in particular was concerned they'd be compromising the quality if they did. They were all praying for a solution. Maggie grabbed her keys and put them in her purse. Joshua was picking her up at 10 and it was nearly that time. She walked into the living room and reached the front door just as she heard a knock. She peeked through the curtain before opening the door. She smiled. Good morning, Joshua. Good morning, Maggie. You look lovely today. Thank you, and you look very handsome. She took in the way his pale blue shirt hugged the muscles in his arms. The sleeves were buttoned at the wrist for a change instead of rolled up to his elbows. That wasn't the only difference. He was wearing tan trousers instead of his customary jeans, and if she wasn't mistaken, she detected a hint of cologne. He was going all out to buy an engagement ring. He looked over his attire. You don't think it's too much? I wanted to make a good impression. Her head tilted. On whom? She had no idea who he'd need to impress other than Stella, who as far as Maggie knew was still in Cootamundra. Stella's not back, is she? No, Joshua replied with a shake of his head. I want the salespeople to see a man who is ready for marriage. Someone who should be in their store to buy an engagement ring. Maggie smiled. I think you fit that bill no matter what you wear. You're too kind. I just felt that. He shrugged. I don't know. That I need to present a good face, he said with a chuckle. I guess I'm being silly. Not at all. This is a very important moment. You want everything to go perfectly. He nodded solemnly. I want to be the man Stella deserves. Maggie placed a comforting hand on his arm. You are. She wouldn't be with you if you weren't. Come on, let's get to Kununurra. You have a ring to buy. The flight to town was uneventful, although Maggie never tired of seeing the countryside from the air. Awe filled her as she gazed across the vast savanna plains and the rivers that had burst their banks and spread so much they looked like inland lakes. Situated amidst the picturesque hills and ranges of the northeast Kimberley region, Kununurra was a town formed to service the Ord River irrigation scheme and was the largest town in the region. Mostly made up of outlying farmland, it was hard to believe that the rugged ochre outcrops lay beyond the lush green fields of mangoes, melons and sugarcane. It seemed like two vastly different places as they flew overhead and eventually landed at the helipad. They picked up a taxi and travelled into the town centre where most shops and restaurants were located. They'd done their homework before travelling, picking a few stores to visit that were in close proximity to save time. The first store they went to was promising. They had a variety of stones and cuts, all of which were stunning, but far too expensive for what they were offering. Maggie understood the concept of supply and demand, but they were a bit ridiculous with their pricing, and after only a few minutes of looking around, she urged Joshua to look elsewhere. The second store, a swanky little place where they had to buzz you in to enter, was better in price but smaller on selection. The pieces were very nice, but both Maggie and Joshua felt that there was better elsewhere. The third store was the winner. The sales representative was pleasant and immediately greeted them when they entered. She was a young woman, no more than 30, her eyes lit up the second she spotted Joshua. Whether he realised it or not, Joshua Goddard was a handsome man and reminded Maggie of Frank in appearance. How may I help you today? The young woman asked. The tag on her blouse said her name was Amy. Good day, Amy. We're looking for an engagement ring. The young woman looked at them curiously. An engagement ring? It was then Maggie realised the young woman's confusion. Chuckling, she answered, It isn't for me, if that's what you're thinking. I didn't think anything, Amy replied. No, the ring isn't for Maggie, she's my stepmother, Joshua stated. It was the first time Maggie had heard him say the word aloud, and it made her smile. Very well. Do you have any idea what kind of ring you're looking for? Amy asked. Joshua shook his head. Show me what you have and I'll figure it out. Amy led them to a showcase filled with rings. They were gold, platinum and rose in colour, with gems that sparkled under the strategically placed lighting. The rings were stunning and were more affordable than what they'd seen earlier. Joshua hovered over the case as Maggie stood beside him observing. There were so many to choose from that she imagined it was difficult to pick one, but Joshua had such focus that it made her heart light. He was very serious about Stella. It showed in the way he wanted to ensure she had the right ring. That one. Amy pulled a large princess-cut diamond ring from the display and held it out to him. Maggie had never seen such a large stone, and her eyes widened when she saw the price tag. That one, Joshua? Are you sure? Yes. Don't you like it? He turned to her and placed the ring in her hand for her to look at. It's stunning, Maggie replied, her mouth twisting slightly as she considered it. What's wrong? Nothing. He looked at her keenly. Please, Maggie, what is it? I know you're thinking something. Why don't you just say it? She lifted her gaze from the ring and placed it back in his hand. It just doesn't seem to be Stella. He frowned. What do you mean? It doesn't seem like something she would wear, Maggie explained. His forehead creased and his shoulders drooped. Oh, what's wrong with it? Isn't it big enough? It's more than big enough. It's just not what I picture Stella wearing. I thought women always wanted a big stone. Maggie smiled at her stepson's naivety. No, Joshua. That isn't all a woman wants. In fact, a woman doesn't want a big stone just for the sake of having it. She wants something that proves you know who she truly is. She wants something that reflects her and shows that you put thought into what she likes, that you know her tastes. She shifted closer and looked at the ring in his hand. When you look at that, does it say Stella to you? He studied the piece for no more than a second before replying, "No, it doesn't." Then it isn't for her. He handed the ring back to Amy and started looking again. This time he took longer, carefully perusing each line of rings. He asked for several before he finally settled on one. This one was simpler, more classic in appearance, with a solitaire diamond and twisted rope band in white gold. He held it up to the light. "This is the one." Maggie smiled. "Are you sure?" "Definitely, this is Stella. It's simple, uncomplicated, but wraps you up completely just the way she did to me," Joshua said, grinning. "I think she'll really like this one. What do you think, Maggie?" "I think it's perfect." His grin broadened as he gave the ring back to Amy and asked her to wrap it. He turned back to Maggie. "Well, that took less time than I expected." "It did. I was sure we'd be here for a couple of hours at least," she replied. "What do you want to do now, head back to the helipad?" "No. I think we should celebrate finding a ring so quickly. What do you say to lunch on me?" The cheer in his voice echoed the joy in his heart. In the 2 years she'd been part of the family, she'd never seen him so happy. "I think lunch sounds wonderful." "Great. Let me pay for the ring and I'll take you to this nice little place Stella introduced me to. It has some of the best juices around, and the chef uses only farm-to-table produce, nothing frozen or preserved. It makes the food that much better." Maggie chuckled. "I had no idea things like that interested you." "They do. I care about what I put in my body, though you might not think so. I know this is the only one I have and I need to take care of it. Besides, I can't afford to get sick with all the work we have to do. But to be honest, I mostly like it because of Stella. Everything she does is carefully thought out." He grinned. "Everything except dating me." "I'd say that was a good choice." Maggie gave him a wink. Amy returned with the ring in a bag and placed the sales invoice in front of Joshua. He pulled out his card for her to swipe. Once the ring was paid for, he and Maggie left the store and strolled towards the restaurant he had mentioned. "Thank you for saying that," he stated as they crossed the street. "Saying what?" "For saying that Stella dating me is a good choice. It means a lot." "I think very highly of you, Joshua. I'm very glad for you and Stella. I wish you the very best." "Thank you." He stopped walking and looked at her intently. "Thanks for coming with me today. I know we haven't always gotten along. We've hardly spoken since you married Dad, and I'm sorry about that. I guess I was a little upset about it at first." Maggie nodded. "I suspected as much." "I'm sorry. I should have given you a chance before now." He paused and held her gaze. "How about we start over?" "I'd like that," Maggie answered, blinking back tears. "How about we start with a hug?" He smiled and stepped towards her. "Thanks for being part of the family, Maggie. I'm glad Dad married you." Warmth filled her as Joshua wrapped his arms around her. It felt wonderful, as though they were truly starting afresh. God had certainly answered her prayers this time. Chapter 8. Dark clouds blanketed the sky as the sun fought a losing battle to maintain dominance. Though the heaviness of the coming showers loomed in the air, no rain fell as Joshua leaned against the helicopter, his arms folded over his chest, waiting for Stella to arrive. He checked his watch. She was late. He tapped his foot. He was as nervous as a jackrabbit and just as excited. He had his father's approval and the ring. Now all he needed was to ask Stella to marry him, and for her to say yes. He had a plan and just hoped it would come off. His proposal might come as a surprise, but he had every hope she would say yes. He loved her, and he was sure she loved him. Others may think it too soon, but he didn't care. He hoped Stella wouldn't either. He knew what he wanted, and that was to be with her for the rest of his life. She'd shown strength in refusing his advances until he'd gotten himself in the right place. He hadn't been ready for a serious relationship before meeting her, and if she'd said yes 2 years ago, they probably wouldn't be where they were now. Everything has its right time. His heart quickened as a taxi pulled up. He leaned to one side, eager to see if Stella was inside. She was. His heart doubled its pace as he forced himself to stand upright. He brushed the front of his shirt, the fabric making a swishing sound under his hand as he brushed away imaginary dust. He strode towards her. With every step, the smile on his face grew. He was happy to see a large grin on her face as well. Wearing a light rain poncho that came all the way to her ankles, her clothing was hidden except for the hems of her jeans peeking out. She wore a fedora on her head that was once tan, but with the rain, it was now a dark brown. She looked positively drenched, and yet she was still the most beautiful woman Joshua had ever seen. "Got caught in the rain, I see." Not caring how damp she was, he wrapped her in his arms. Oh, it felt good to be holding her again. He kissed the side of her damp hair. "I've missed you so much, Stella." "And I've missed you, Josh. It's great to be home." She pulled back and gave him the most gorgeous of smiles, one that made him think of sunshine and daisies. He cupped her cheeks and kissed her passionately. He would have been happy to stay and kiss her all day, but the rain could catch them at any moment. They needed to get going. He took her bag and they headed to the helicopter. The taxi was late and the sky just opened up. I barely had a chance to get my poncho on before the downpour started. The joys of living in the north. He could listen to her chatter forever. "I have some towels in the chopper. You can dry off a bit before we get home. You should probably change clothes, but from the look of the sky, I doubt we have much time before the rain reaches us. We should get going." Stella shrugged. "I'll be fine." There was another reason why he wanted them to leave right away. He intended to fly over Indigo so she could see her childhood home. Then, when she was happy and lost in her memories, he planned to pull out the ring and propose. It sounded like a good plan to him. He hoped she'd think so too. He stuffed her bag in the back while she got into the co-pilot's seat. He reached into his bag and stuffed the box containing the ring into his pocket. He walked around the front of the helicopter and climbed in. Starting the engine, he looked at her and smiled. "Here we go." She removed her hat and shook her hair out. The golden strands were now dark, clumping together around her shoulders and frizzing where it was dry. "Did I tell you how beautiful you look?" "No, you didn't, but I hardly think I deserve the compliment right now." "What are you talking about? You look great." "Better than great. Gorgeous." She laughed heartily. "You're just saying that. I look like a drowned wallaroo. Hardly a beauty." He chuckled. "Then you're the prettiest wallaroo in all of Australia." "Thank you, Joshua." She said his name with a smile as a blush crept up her cheeks. He gazed at her, thankful that the helicopter didn't require as keen a focus as a car because all he wanted to do was gaze at her. Drink her in. He admired her hair, fighting the urge to coil the strands around his fingers and inhale the lavender scent. He didn't know what shampoo she used, but the scent was unmistakable. He loved it. It didn't seem possible, but she looked better than when she'd left. "Did things go well with your family?" he asked as Kununurra grew smaller beneath them. "Better than I imagined. It was good getting to know my family, especially the ones I'd not met before. It was also wonderful seeing how well my parents are doing. You know, I thought they'd still be upset about losing the station, but they're actually happier now than they've ever been." "Really?" Joshua's brow lifted. "Yes, Mum's enjoying her teacher aide position and Dad's happy with his job in the council. The reduced responsibility and stress mean he can take it easier. He looks younger, if you can believe that." Joshua smiled. "That's good. I'm sure that made you happy." "It did. It also made me see how foolish I've been about Indigo." She flopped back against her seat. "I wanted to get it back for them, but they didn't need it. They're doing fine all by themselves." Joshua turned as Stella spoke. Her head was down and her voice was quiet. Despite what she said, he could tell she still missed her home on the station. Getting it back had meant so much to her. He nodded to himself. His plan should work. He turned the helicopter in the direction of Indigo. Stella was distracted by drying her hair and seemingly didn't notice their change of direction. Joshua grinned as the arid, harsh lands appeared, leaving all traces of the town behind. It took several minutes before the wild land changed into something more ordered. There were stations and farms all around Kununurra, but the trail to Indigo was uninhabited and isolated. She flipped her hair forward, drying the back strands as she hummed a tune. Stella loved singing. It was something Joshua had noticed long before they became a couple. It was as if she was always happy, even when she wasn't. She had joy in her heart, just like that song they used to sing in Sunday school as children. Indigo Downs was 120 kilometres south of Kununurra. The landscape changed less than 10 minutes after leaving the town, and soon they were flying over the familiar setting of a cattle station. Joshua wasn't sure when Stella realised where they were, but when he faced her, her eyes were wide and her mouth agape as she stared at the station below. Her eyes lit up and a broad smile filled her face with joy. She whispered softly, "Indigo." He took in the station, noting the various buildings. He could make out the homestead beneath them, what looked like a mechanic shop off to the right and a plant nursery nearby. The high ground was sandy brown and pale red, with splatters of brown and pale green grass, and the occasional large cluster of bright green from the trees. It reminded him of a quilt. In the distance, where the land was greenest, there was a large body of water. "Is that a lake?" "A dam," Stella replied. "It's part of the irrigation system. I wanted to use it for hydropower." "That's a brilliant idea. Why didn't you?" "It costs a lot to do the conversion and the money never presented itself. I prayed so much for some way to make it happen, but it never did. I suppose it was God's way of telling me not to waste my money since the station wasn't going to stay in the family anyway." His heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine what his family would do if they lost Goddard Downs. It would never happen as long as he lived. His father would never allow it, but neither would he. He loved the station, even if at one time he'd wanted to go his own way. He reached out and took her hand. "I'm so sorry you lost it, Stella." Melancholy tainted the beautiful cadence of her voice. "Thank you. I had such wonderful times here. After being in the hospital for so long and being away from my parents because of it, finally living at Indigo was like a dream. I was determined never to leave. I wanted to spend the rest of my life on the station. I was sure it would happen. It was all I thought of." She took a long breath as Joshua brought the helicopter to a hover over the homestead. It was a bungalow, not unlike Goddard Downs, although it was about half the size. It did house fewer people. There'd been only Stella and her parents, while Goddard Downs housed more than 10 when the entire family was there. She was nostalgic as Joshua lowered the helicopter to the ground. "I know we were small, but I hoped we could grow with time. I thought I could help Dad make this station into one of the best in the Kimberley. Now look at it. Sitting idle for someone to snatch up and do who knows what with." She raised her gaze to Joshua and her voice hitched. "They might change everything. Erase my entire childhood and turn it into a resort or something ridiculous like that. They could do whatever they wanted and I couldn't stop them." "Stella." Joshua's tone was gentle, a caution to her before she upset herself further. He knew how difficult losing the station was and the tears she'd cried over it. But this wasn't the time to rehash. He wanted her to remember the good times, not the bad. This wasn't going to plan at all. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to dampen the mood. I guess I'm not over losing the station as much as I thought I was. I didn't mean to upset you. I thought you'd like to see it. I thought it would be a nice surprise." "It was a nice surprise and I do like seeing it," she insisted. "It reminds me of so many good times. But it also reminds me of the fact that those times are over and that I never achieved my dream. Joshua's brows knitted. Your dream? I always wanted to make Indigo a success, much like Goddard Downs. Our herd was never as large, but I always believed we could do just as well in our own right. I hoped we could improve the facilities, make enough to expand the property and buy another 1,000 acres or so, and then add to our livestock. We could have added tours and cattle drives, much like you're doing now. But I also dreamed of diversifying into renewable energy and starting a small fishery. A fishery? Joshua's eyes widened. This was the first he'd heard of any of this. Yes, Stella chuckled. I had such ideas, but I never shared them. Dad was working on getting things stable on the station, and I didn't want to overwhelm him with ideas that couldn't be acted upon. Joshua smiled as he toyed with a lock of her hair and gazed deeply into her eyes. You need to tell me more about your ideas. Her eyes twinkled. You'd have to promise not to laugh. Some of them are pretty far out there. He chuckled. I'm sure they're great. But why don't we head for home and you can tell me about them after you get out of your wet clothes and have something to eat? Her mood was picking up and he wanted to keep it that way. Score 0 for the Indigo proposal. Smiling, she agreed that heading home was the best idea. She slipped her hand into his as he pulled back on the stick and the helicopter rose off the ground. Minutes later, they were in the air and headed in the direction of Goddard Downs. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the helicopter landed outside the homestead. The sky had darkened, and Joshua guessed they had less than half an hour before the storm hit. He turned the engine off and jumped down before jogging to the other side to lift Stella down. She was more than capable of getting out on her own, but he wanted to hold her, kiss her, propose to her. What made him think that proposing to her at Indigo would ever work? It was such a stupid idea. Her hair was dry, but the rain had made it curly. She looked so innocent and drop-dead gorgeous. He lowered his mouth and kissed her gently. I love you, Stella. I love you too, Josh. The words were a balm to his soul. She loved him. When a loud clap of thunder boomed overhead, he almost dropped her. We'd best hurry or we'll get wet. She planted a kiss on his lips and wriggled to the ground. He didn't care if they got wet, but he let her go and grabbed her bags. I'll grab a shower and then I'll be over, she said when they reached her cabin. I'll come and get you. No need, I'll be fine. But what if it's raining? I've got an umbrella. Her spunky grin made his heart burst with love. Okay, but don't be long. I won't. She smiled and went inside. He left her and hurried to the homestead. With Maggie's family still there, the house was bursting at the seams, and he wanted to be sure there was a place for Stella at the table. Passing the door to the living room, his dad called out, How did it go, Josh? A moment later, he appeared in the doorway wearing a lopsided grin. Well? It didn't. Joshua's shoulders fell. I think I need to rethink my plan. Things didn't go as I'd hoped, so I thought it best to put off the proposal for a better time. His dad squeezed his shoulder. You'll know the right time, son. No sense in rushing things. There's a perfect time for everything. And a season for everything under the sun. Is that what the scripture says? Joshua remembered some of what his parents taught him as a child, but it was sometimes foggy from years of disregarding it. Something like that, his dad answered, smiling. Dinner's almost ready. Will Stella be joining us? Yes, she's grabbing a shower first. She got drenched in town. It'll be good to have her with us again, the family all under one roof. His father's eagerness to accept Stella was touching, especially since he was still grieving for Julian. I can't turn back the clock, Dad, but I can be the son you deserve. Joshua patted his dad on the arm. I'll go set a place for her. Not bothering to unpack after Joshua left, Stella headed straight for the bathroom, stripped off and jumped into the shower. As the hot water gushed over her body, she warmed up quickly. She didn't linger, although after being chilled in the rain, it was tempting to stay longer. She quickly towel-dried her hair and slipped into a pair of white capri and a light blue shirt. She left her hair down. It was still damp, but there was no time to dry it properly, so she rubbed some product through to stop the frizz. Not that it ever worked in this climate. It was also useless applying makeup, as it would slide off as soon as she stepped outside. But she was hopeful that a light coat of mascara and some lip gloss might stay put. As she walked to the homestead a few moments later, flashes of lightning split the distant sky and were followed by long, low rumbles of thunder. The sky had changed to an ominous grey, and she could feel the barometric pressure falling. If she was right, a doozy of a storm was coming. A shudder ran down her spine. What if they hadn't made it back in time? If they'd stayed longer at Indigo? She didn't want to think about it. The last place she wanted to be was in a helicopter during a storm. She'd experienced it once before, and it wasn't something she wanted to repeat, ever. She quickened her pace. Joshua was standing on the wraparound veranda when she reached the homestead. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing when he met her in Kununurra, but he'd done something with his hair. Slicked it back? Maybe. Whatever he'd done, he looked smarter, fresher. He was so handsome, and she'd missed him so much it hurt. Their gazes met and her pulse skittered. His smile was warm, the kind that simmered at his lips and made her insides go to mush. Was this what love felt like? It had to be. He rushed down the stairs and gathered her in his arms. She tilted her mouth to his and let his lips graze hers. She'd never tire of his kisses, but the family would be waiting for them. "We need to go in," she whispered. Grunting, he deepened the kiss. For a moment, she lost herself, savouring every moment. But then she pulled back. "We really need to go inside." Joshua groaned. "I know." He gazed into her eyes, and for another moment she was tempted to stay outside with him, despite the approaching storm and the family inside waiting for them. He stole another kiss and then grabbed her hand. They walked up the stairs together and paused before entering the dining room. Stella took a deep breath. Although she knew the Goddards, she didn't know Maggie's family, and they were all there. Joshua squeezed her hand before they made their entrance. Everyone looked up and smiled. Maggie stood and greeted her with a big hug, which Stella returned before Maggie introduced her to her family. They seemed a wonderful bunch, although it was difficult not to notice Serena's scarring. Although she wore a colourful bandana over her hair, her skin was disfigured and dark. But her eyes were bright and her demeanour cheerful. She seemed like someone Stella would like to get to know. Maggie's obvious pride in her children and grandchildren made Stella wish that she could be as fortunate someday. She'd always wanted a big family. But did Joshua? They'd never discussed it, but it was a conversation they needed to have. She stopped herself. What was she doing? They were a long way from having children. They'd only been dating for 4 months. They weren't even talking about marriage. 4 months wasn't long, but to her, it felt like forever, as though they'd spent a lifetime together in such a short space of time. All of a sudden, all she wanted was to be with him. To find a quiet place where they could be alone. How she'd missed their solitary rides and long conversations. Although they'd spoken every day on the phone, it wasn't the same. Frank stood at the head of the table and asked for quiet. Joshua directed her to a chair between him and Olivia. As she was sitting, Olivia faced her and smiled. It was nice to feel welcome, like she belonged. Like this was her family. She stopped quickly. She was getting way too ahead of herself. Frank cleared his voice. The last few months had aged him, and although he was still a handsome man, his hair had turned completely grey and he looked thinner, gaunt even. Losing a son in the manner he had would do that to a person. Stella's heart went out to him. "Before we give thanks, I'd like to welcome Stella back to our fold." He nodded her way and gave a warm smile. Everyone looked at her again while Joshua squeezed her hand. "Let's pray." Stella bowed her head as Frank's voice filled the room. "Lord God, we give you thanks for the day that's been, for the many blessings you've bestowed on us, for the gift of family and friends, and for this food. Bless it to our bodies. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen." A chorus of amens echoed around the table before everybody relaxed and started chatting again. Janella and Sasha had cooked up a feast of Goddard Downs' roast beef and homegrown vegetables with all the trimmings. Once dinner was over, everyone adjourned to the living room for coffee and dessert. Sasha was a brilliant baker, and the dessert cake she'd made from rum and molasses was superb. The storm was still rumbling around and flashes of lightning could be seen through the windows. Joshua stood with Nathan and Frank while Stella chatted with Olivia. They were within hearing distance of the men, and every time Joshua spoke, the sound of his voice sent a warm current through her. "You were lucky to get back before it hit," Nathan said. "Not lucky, mate. It was planned," Joshua replied with a laugh. "It's going to be bad," Frank said solemnly. "The hands were out checking the fences earlier. Kittredge is down at the river checking the banks. See if we're in for some flooding." "There'll be some for sure," Nathan commented. "How much is the question?" Stella swung her gaze to Frank and Joshua. Memories of another flood would be in their thoughts, and she silently prayed that this one wouldn't result in any fatalities. A short while later, Joshua sidled up to her and slipped his arms around her from behind. "Take a walk with me?" he whispered in her ear. His voice was filled with urgency and something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She turned and faced him. Now? The rain could start any second. "I don't mind getting caught in the rain with you, Stella. Come on, let's go." Something in his tone made her agree. He grabbed her hand and they slipped out quietly. No one other than Frank and Maggie seemed to notice them leaving, but the gleam in their eyes made her curious. She clung to Joshua as they headed outside. The air smelled earthy and clouds scudded across the sky as though being chased by a monster. The storm would be here soon. "It's eerily beautiful, though it's a little crazy to be out in it," she said. "I know." Joshua pulled her closer as they picked up their pace. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Not far." He led her to a small canopied grove she'd not seen before. It was tucked away so that unless you knew it was there, you'd miss it. He stopped at the far end where the grove gave way to the huge sky. Dropping to one knee, he gazed up at her and took her hand. "Stella, there's something I want to ask you." A clap of thunder directly overhead made them both jump, but his gaze remained steadfast. Her heart pounded. He was going to propose. A flash of lightning illuminated him and the ring nestled between his fingers. "I wanted to do this at the perfect time, but then I realised it didn't matter. I love you with all my heart, Stella, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Stella Martin, will you marry me?" Chapter 9. Thunder boomed overhead, but it was nothing compared to the thudding of Stella's heart. Joshua had proposed. She stared at the diamond ring standing tall between his fingertips, unable to speak, barely able to think, as he waited for her answer. He'd stunned her, caught her unawares. Although she'd dreamed of this moment, she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "Joshua," her voice trembled. "Yes?" Their gazes met over the glistening stone, and for a moment, neither spoke. Her breath hitched as one question burned in her mind. Am I ready? They'd only been together 4 months. What would her parents think? She'd only spoken of Joshua briefly during her visit. Although she'd conveyed her deep feelings for him, it wasn't a conversation that indicated marriage was on the horizon. What would Frank and Maggie think? The entire Goddard family had welcomed her into their ranks, but now Joshua was wanting to make her one of them. Did they know he was planning this? Would they accept her? "I know what you must be thinking." Joshua pushed up from his knee and stepped closer. "You're thinking this is too soon, that you aren't sure we're ready." Stella managed a small, tentative smile and nodded silently. He knew her thoughts because he must have pondered the same question. Yet here he was with a ring in his hand. She took a deep breath. "Are you sure about this?" "With all my heart," His voice was barely a whisper as he pressed his forehead to hers. She closed her eyes at the tender touch. Her heart took flight whenever he was near, and it soared now. But negative thoughts bombarded her, confusing her. This is crazy. You can't get married so soon. You haven't been together long enough. What will people think? She inched forward. She wanted this so much. Most girls dreamed of a romantic proposal. They dissected how it would happen and who would do the asking. They daydreamed about wedding dresses and receptions. She was like any girl growing up. She wanted to be swept off her feet. However, Joshua's proposal wasn't a sweeping. It was a gentle envelopment, like a tender hand around a baby bird. She searched her heart. She loved him. There was no question about that. And he loved her, she was sure of it. But were they ready for marriage? Lord, please guide me. I want to do your will. Stella? Joshua said her name gently and reached for her hand, the ring still in his other. This is usually where you answer. He chuckled. He was trying to be funny, but she could hear the nervousness in his voice. She'd never heard it before, and she found it oddly endearing. He wanted her to say yes. She wanted to also, but was it the right thing? There is a time for everything under the sun. Was this their time? She squeezed his hands and the outline of the ring pressed into her palm as their hands closed around it. Thunder rumbled and lightning split the night sky. But underneath the grove, she felt safe and at peace with Joshua. You took me by surprise. I know. And if you need more time, that's fine, but I want you to know that I love you and want to spend the rest of my life with you. You make my life worth living, Stella. I can't imagine living without you. Oh, Joshua. A small chuckle escaped her. She held his gaze as peace washed over her like a warm blanket, and in that instant, she knew. I love you too, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. So yes, I'll marry you. Stepping forward, she threw her arms around his neck and hugged him. His strong arms wound tight around her. He lifted her off the ground and spun her around as his laughter echoed through the grove and disappeared into the night. Their joy drowned out the storm and every doubt. It felt like a dream. Everyone would think they were crazy. She didn't care. The tug Joshua had on her heart was something special, something eternal. It was one spirit recognizing another. They were meant to be, she was sure of it. I love you, Joshua. And I love you, Stella. As he set her on the ground, their lips met. His kiss was tender at first, but quickly grew urgent. She entwined her fingers in the hair at the nape of his neck and pulled him closer. His kiss was intoxicating, and when their lips parted, her head felt light. They gazed into each other's eyes while he gently slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She couldn't help but admire it as it adorned her hand, a promise for all to see. It wasn't big or flashy, but it was exactly what she would have chosen. She smiled as she lifted her gaze. It's perfect. Thank you. Oh, I'm glad you like it. This is a dream come true, Joshua. I never thought I could love someone so much. Happy tears stung the backs of her eyes. And I never thought that someone as beautiful as you could ever love me. He rested his hand lightly against her cheek. You're loving, kind, and compassionate. Smart, brave, and determined. I've never seen you falter in your faith. She laughed. Wow, you're really loading on the superlatives. I don't know what they are, but I know I love you with every fibre of my being, and I'm going to be the best husband you could ever want. The only husband I want, she grinned. He chuckled as he lowered his mouth and whispered, Yeah, the only one. A loud crash of thunder shook the ground beneath them. I think we should get back to the house, he whispered while stealing another kiss. I think so too, but we'll get soaked. I guess we didn't bring umbrellas? Nope. Looks like we're running through the rain. He took her hand, And by the time they reached the other end of the grove, the heavens had opened and heavy rain was pelting down. They clung to each other and sprinted to the house, laughter filling their lungs as rain permeated every stitch of clothing, but Stella didn't care. So long as Joshua was with her, she'd run 1,000 miles in the rain. He was her soulmate, and she loved him with her whole heart. Worry tugged at Frank's mind as he peered out the window. Joshua and Stella hadn't returned, and rain was falling in torrents. Conditions around the station would be perilous. As a flash of lightning lit the sky, he squinted. There was no sign of them. "They should have headed back before the rain started," he growled to no one in particular. Maggie stepped beside him and rested a comforting hand on his shoulder. "They probably got caught when the rain started and took shelter somewhere. I'm sure they'll be fine." "They shouldn't have gone out. They knew the storm was coming. It may have stalled a bit, but Joshua knows how unpredictable the weather is at this time of year. Stella should know that too. They should have stayed inside." Maggie leaned closer and whispered, "But you know he had something special to ask her." "He could have picked a better time." "Perhaps, but sometimes these things won't wait. I'm sure they'll be okay." Frank grunted. "I suppose you're right." "Don't work yourself up, Dad," Olivia called from the couch where William was standing on her lap sucking his thumb. "They both know what to do in this kind of weather." "I know, but I'd feel better knowing they were safe." For the first time, he recognised the fear that lay beneath his anxiety. Having lost Esther and Julian, that dreadful emotion was taking advantage of his weakness and wrapping itself around his heart and mind. He didn't like it. It was wrong, but it was real. The truth was, he feared for Joshua and Stella. His fear might not be rational, but it was there, nibbling away at his insides. How would he survive if another loved one was snatched from him? Maggie rubbed his arm. "Come on, I'll make you a coffee." He inhaled deeply. Coffee would help. "Thanks, love. I'll come with you." He glanced around the room. "Anyone else want a drink?" All heads shook. He followed Maggie into the kitchen, and while she turned the percolator on, he braced himself against the counter. He hadn't felt fear like this in years, yet here it was like a spiteful mite biting at the recesses of his mind. "Lord, help me give this to you." Clenching his fists, he breathed deeply and sat at the table. Fear wasn't of God. It was a parasite that sought to suck the life from you. He couldn't deny its power. Maggie sat beside him and took his hand. "We should pray." Yes, that's what was needed. Prayer. Nodding, he bowed his head and centered his thoughts on God. "Heavenly Father, I come before you now, seeking peace. So much has happened, and right now, I admit that fear has took a hold of my heart. You didn't give a spirit of fear, but one of power, love, and a sound mind. Lord, although fear is trying to bind me, I don't want to entertain it. With your strength, I won't entertain it. I claim your peace instead, and entrust Joshua and Stella into your care. I hand my worry and fear to you. In Jesus' precious name, Amen." "Yes, Lord," Maggie continued in a soft voice. "We do entrust Joshua and Stella to you, and I pray that your peace, which surpasses all understanding, will guard Frank's heart and mind in Christ Jesus. Lord, we know that fear is not of you, and yet we so often give in to it. Help us to look to you in all things and to live in such a way that brings glory to you. Forgive us when we take our eyes off you, and gently draw us back to a position of trust. In Jesus' precious name, Amen." Frank opened his eyes and smiled. "Thank you, my love. I needed that." "I know you did. But God understands, Frank. He really does. He knows how much you love your family and how much you've been through. But He's also with Joshua and Stella right now." A grin spread across her face. "And you never know, they might return with exciting news." "As usual, my love, you're absolutely correct. He squeezed her hand and held her gaze for several moments. He was so blessed she was in his life. He raised her hand and kissed it gently. "Now, where's that coffee you promised?" She grinned again. "Coming right up." Pushing to her feet, she kissed him on the cheek before filling 2 mugs from the percolator. She added a dash of milk to each and handed him one. "Here you are." He smiled gratefully as he took it. "Thank you. I guess we should go back and join the others." She nodded, and together they returned to the living room where most of the family was engrossed in a game of Monopoly. They sat on the lounge and watched while sipping their drinks. 5 minutes later, the door burst open and a sopping Joshua and Stella appeared in the doorway. Frank jumped to his feet, as did Maggie and Janella. "What were you thinking going out in weather like this?" Janella asked, fussing over them. Before either could answer, Olivia sprinted down the hallway and returned moments later with an armful of towels. Grabbing one from her, Joshua began drying himself. The rain came in faster than we expected. As Olivia handed a cream-coloured towel to Stella, Frank's gaze dropped to Stella's hand and the glint of the diamond on her finger. His heart swelled. His son had done it. Joshua had proposed. Frank lifted his gaze and found his son's. A large grin brightened Joshua's face. He looked younger, happier. Not since before his mother's death had he looked so content. Frank gave a nod, and reaching for Maggie's hand, he whispered in her ear, "Looks like we have a wedding to plan." Chapter 10. Janella couldn't love Frank, Olivia, and the rest of the family more. Their love and support had gotten her through the days following Julian's death. The days when her heart hurt in her chest so badly, and the nights when she couldn't sleep, and tears flowed endlessly. Although she appreciated all they did, it still wasn't enough to heal her pain. The only person who came close to truly understanding how she felt was Frank. They were comrades in loss, but his loss was behind him. And new love coloured the way he saw the world. Not for Janella. Her sky was still cast in black. Only the children were able to bring any light, and only because she knew they needed her if they were to make it through. They needed each other. Having the family around for the holidays did little to ease the sorrow she felt. She kept her children close, and they seemed to share her need to be near each other. Caleb, who usually hovered around his grandfather, was always nearby, but Sasha was her shadow. In the garden or kitchen, her daughter was by her side constantly. She'd even started baking, discovering a hidden talent that Janella sought to nourish. Working side by side in the kitchen helped to distract them from the fact that things were no longer the same. Julian wasn't supposed to have died. She'd only ever loved one man, Julian, her childhood sweetheart. They were supposed to grow old and sit on the porch together in their rockers watching their grandchildren and great-grandchildren play. He'd never get to see those children. He wouldn't even be the one taking Caleb to Darwin to start school. It wasn't supposed to be like this, but she couldn't allow her pain to dampen Christmas for everyone else. So instead of crying, she cooked. Seated on the couch while Caleb played Monopoly with the adults, Janella hugged Sasha to her side, unable to help the sense of aloneness engulfing her. Olivia had Nathan. Serena had David. Maggie had Frank. And even Joshua had Stella. When the pair slipped out earlier, memories of when she and Julian were young and in love flooded back and revived her grief. She didn't think it right they should flout their new relationship in front of her. She didn't begrudge them love, if that's what it was, although she doubted it was for Joshua. Infatuation, more like. However, Stella seemed to be a calming influence on him, she had to admit. But seeing them together, enjoying each other's company, made her loss more real. When they burst through the door looking like drowned rats, she rushed to help them. It was her nature to help, but she couldn't stop the tirade that flowed from her mouth. All her pain and grief were centred on this couple who had what she no longer had. Each other. "What were you thinking going out in weather like this?" She glanced at Stella but narrowed her gaze on Joshua. You knew the storm was coming. Your dad was worried sick about you." He shrugged, a sheepish grin on his face. "We're fine. Just a bit wet." "A bit? You're drenched. Take these towels and dry yourselves." As Stella took a towel from Olivia and began drying her hair, a glint on her hand caught Janella's eye. It couldn't be. She must be seeing things. A trick of the light, perhaps. But when Stella's hand stilled enough for her to get a better look, her eyes widened. It was undeniable. Stella was wearing an engagement ring. Janella's gaze swung between Stella and Joshua while she searched their faces, too stunned to speak. But Olivia wasn't. "What's this?" she asked, stepping closer and taking hold of Stella's hand. Moments later, she shrieked with elation. "Oh my, Dad, come here! Did you see this? Joshua and Stella are engaged!" "Calm down, Liv," Joshua laughed. "How do you expect me to do that? You two are getting married!" The room buzzed with excitement as everyone, except Janella, clamoured to gaze at the diamond solitaire. She slipped into the background. Julian was dead only months, and Joshua was getting married? He barely knew Stella. How could he possibly think they were suited enough for marriage? Didn't he know marriage wasn't a game? That it was for life? Pain stabbed her chest as she recalled the vows she and Julian had exchanged. The promises they'd made. The love that was meant to last forever. She looked at Joshua. He had no concept of what that entailed. He'd spent his entire life bouncing here and there, never committing to anything, not even the station. Now, he thought he was ready to take on a lifelong commitment before God? He was deluding himself. The sting of tears burned her eyes. She wanted to speak, but the words danced on the tip of her tongue, unwilling to leap from her mouth. When Frank stepped forward, she was sure that as a man of reason, he'd stop the madness and tell Joshua he was making a mistake. Then everyone would come to their senses. But no. He wore a broad smile and gave them bear hugs. "Congratulations. I wish you both every happiness." Janella choked on the air. Frank thought this was a good idea? How could she speak her mind now? Frank was the voice of reason and head of the family. How could she challenge what he sanctioned? Her head was about to explode. Retreating further, she slumped onto the couch and tried to assemble her thoughts. They'd notice if she didn't say something. But what could she say? The truth was out of the question. Everyone was smiling, patting Joshua on the back and circling a grinning Stella as they took it in turns to admire her ring. They were happy. How could she rob them of that? Although she didn't share their happiness, she couldn't ruin everyone else's joy. Sasha approached, her face contorted. "Mum?" Janella reached out and took her hand. "Yes, sweetie. Are you okay?" Concern laced her daughter's voice. How many times had she asked that recently? Too many. It was Janella's place to comfort her daughter, not the other way around. She squeezed Sasha's hand and smiled. "I'm okay. Just a touch of a headache." Serena turned in her direction. "You have a headache?" The others turned to Janella. Looks of concern replaced the joy of the moment. She couldn't be responsible for that. She straightened and forced herself to sound cheerful. "I'm fine, really. It's nothing serious. Barely a niggle." "Are you sure, Janella?" Joshua stepped closer and sounded genuinely concerned, which surprised her. He wasn't normally that caring. She wanted to say that she wasn't all right, that she thought he'd lost his mind, but she didn't. She rose to her feet and forced herself to smile as she reached up and hugged him. "Perfectly. Congratulations, Joshua. You and Stella make a picture-perfect couple." Her words seemed to allay everyone's concerns, including Sasha's, who smiled and then continued ogling Stella's ring. Janella's heart clenched. Her daughter was so young. To her, romance was an exciting wonder she looked forward to one day, not the labour of love required to make a marriage last. Janella's gaze drifted to Stella. She was as clueless as Sasha if she thought being married to Joshua would be a walk in the park. Slumping back onto the couch, she pulled one of the cushions onto her lap and hugged it. Everyone was happy again and had forgotten about her. You're alone now, Janella. You have to remember that. Everyone has someone. You just have yourself. The cruel thoughts continued as she sat there, falling further and further into misery. Although she and Julian went through tough times, they understood each other. They'd known each other since they were kids. What did Joshua know about Stella in a few months? Her gaze drifted to where he stood shaking David's hand. You're making a mistake, Joshua. I pray you realise that before it's too late. Lord, let them see sense. She hugged the pillow tighter and fought tears as her gaze caught a glimpse of a picture on the sideboard. It was of her and Julian as newlyweds, taken on the morning they left for a camping trip with friends. His smile was so brilliant it took her breath away. It still did. Julian never made breakfast, but he did that day. It was such a sweet gesture, although it tasted awful and she wound up making something more edible to take with them. She smiled at the memory. His love made all the difference in her life. It nullified every negative thought she had about herself and the lies others told her. She was Indigenous, coloured, looked down on by society. He was the opposite. The eldest Goddard's son, highly regarded by all. They should never have fallen in love. When he went off to school in Darwin, she'd feared he'd forget all about her when he saw all there was to be had outside the boundaries of Goddard Downs. But he didn't. He was faithful for all the years he was away and all the years after. He never strayed. Keeping no secrets, he even told her when someone caught his eye. Her husband hadn't been perfect, but he was hers. What they shared often didn't make sense to the world around them, but it was right for them. An errant tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly brushed it aside before anyone noticed. Her darling Julian. He never gave himself a break or allowed himself to relax. He always wanted to be right, always wanted to be a good son and to prove he was worthy of the responsibility he craved. He never had to prove anything to her. She saw him, and he saw her past her skin colour, her family, her lack of education. He understood her on a level no one else did. They truly loved each other when so many said they shouldn't. She wanted Joshua to know a love like that. Perhaps Stella was the one, but they hadn't had enough time to test their relationship, to see if it was true and could withstand the test of time. They needed to learn about each other, the way she'd learned about Julian. They needed to make such a big decision when the cloud of grief wasn't hovering over them, masking their loss with a promise of happiness. That's what it was. Joshua felt sad about Julian and wanted the pain to go away. If only it was that simple. If it were, she would have easily found some way to make her sorrow vanish, but it wasn't. And jumping into marriage wasn't the answer. She gazed around at the smiling faces in the room. They all wanted to be happy, to forget the pain of Julian's loss. That was why they were so quick to embrace this foolhardy idea of Joshua's. In time, they'd come to see it was a mistake. They would see it as she did now. Olivia approached the couch where Janella was sitting. Janella, can you help me get some drinks to toast with? Sure. Pushing up from her seat, she followed Olivia to the kitchen, glancing over her shoulder as she left the room. She'd speak with Joshua another time, but for now, she'd let him have his moment of happiness.
Slow Dance at Dusk continues in Volume 2, Chapters 11 to 22. Click the link below to keep listening.